It was a Saturday morning in Plano, Texas, a kind of morning where everything seemed to be in its rightful place. The sun was still low in the sky, casting a warm golden hue over the neighborhood. Families were out, mowing lawns, washing cars, and sipping coffee, while kids zipped around on bikes along the quiet cul-de-sacs. It was a scene you'd expect on any suburban street, the kind of day where nothing extraordinary would ever happen. But on that morning, as Reginald Carter stepped out of his two-story brick home with nothing more pressing on his mind than taking the trash to the curb, everything changed. He didn't even make it 10 steps before he noticed them. 3 figures standing at the edge of his driveway. 2 men in black tactical vests, patches reading community enforcement stitched across their chests. And standing between them, arms crossed tightly, was none other than Linda Whitfield, the president of the Homeowners Association. She wasn't smiling, neither were they. Reginald paused mid-step, his hand still gripping the trash bag. Something about the trio didn't add up. The 2 men looked off, their vests mismatched. One was too big for the man wearing it, the other had Velcro straps hanging loose like they'd been slapped together in a hurry. Their boots were scuffed and worn like they'd been bought secondhand. And the way they stood, too stiff, too rehearsed, wasn't quite right. Might have looked official to a nervous neighbor, but Reginald wasn't fooled. "Mr. Carter," Linda's voice broke the silence. She was standing a little taller than usual, the air of authority around her more palpable today. "We need to talk." He set the trash bag down slowly, his gaze flicking from Linda to the 2 men behind her. They all had the same stiff expressions, like they were putting on a show. "About what?" Reginald asked, his tone steady but laced with suspicion. One of the men, tall and pale with a shaved head, stepped forward. He wore mirrored sunglasses that hid his eyes, making it impossible to gauge his intentions. He spoke flatly, his voice rehearsed. "You're in violation of neighborhood regulations," he said. "We're here to detain you until the police arrive." The words hit the air like a rock. "Detain me?" Reginald couldn't help but laugh, the sound low but full of disbelief. "Detain me?" he repeated, his eyebrows raising. "For what?" Linda unfolded a piece of paper she'd been holding. Her lips tightened as she glanced at the sheet. "You've ignored repeated notices. This has gone too far. We can't have someone undermining the rules of this neighborhood. You need to comply, Mr. Carter." Reginald's lips thinned into a slight grin as he took a step forward, his posture shifting. "And what exactly are the charges?" he asked, his voice still steady, his eyes never leaving the 2 men. The shorter one, broad-shouldered with a messy beard, pulled another piece of paper from his vest and handed it to Linda. She quickly scanned it before turning it toward Reginald. "Property violations, non-compliance with HOA orders, unauthorized modifications to your driveway, loud gatherings," she trailed off. "The list goes on." Reginald glanced at the list for a moment, his mind already forming a response. He looked back up at the 2 men. "So, you think that gives you the right to walk onto my property and... what was it you said? Detain me?" The tall man's jaw tightened. "That's right," he said, his voice barely containing the hint of a threat. "You can come peacefully, or we'll make it harder on you." The neighborhood was silent for a moment, like the world itself had paused. Reginald felt eyes on him. A curtain shifted in a window down the street. Someone was watching. Another curtain moved. The audience was growing, drawn by the tension unfolding in front of them. Reginald's gaze shifted to the street, his voice calm but cutting. "Let me explain something to you," he said, his eyes locking with the taller man. "There is no such thing as community enforcement. You're not law enforcement. You don't have any authority here, and right now, you're trespassing." "Community enforcement." Linda's face flushed with anger, but she held her ground. "Don't talk to me about authority, Reginald. You think you're above the rules. Because of who you are?" Her words spit out, sharp and angry. We've had complaints, real complaints. I'm not going to sit by and let this neighborhood fall apart." Reginald raised an eyebrow. The taller man, still rigid, hovered his hand near his belt like he was about to pull something, maybe a weapon, maybe something else. But Reginald knew better. He'd dealt with men like this before. Wannabe enforcers who thought a vest and a stern face made them untouchable. But what they didn't know was that Reginald Carter wasn't just any resident. He wasn't a homeowner caught off guard by an overzealous HOA president. Reginald Carter was a trained federal agent. Years of experience dismantling criminal networks, years spent interrogating dangerous men, years spent dealing with situations far worse than this. These two imposters didn't stand a chance. Instead of revealing his true identity, Reginald simply smiled, a smile that could send chills down anyone's spine. "You've picked the wrong driveway today." And just like that, everything changed. The air between them was thick with tension. Reginald had just stepped into the role of a man who wasn't about to back down. And the neighborhood, the ones watching, waiting for something to unfold, were about to witness a confrontation like no other. But they wouldn't know it yet. For now, the only thing that hung in the air was the sound of a soda can clattering across the concrete, falling from Reginald's trash bag. The metallic echo was the only thing that could be heard as the three figures stood their ground, and Reginald calmly stood his own. Plano, Texas. A place known for its tree-lined streets, manicured lawns, and suburban tranquility. Saturdays here were the epitome of small-town peace. Families mowing their lawns, children riding bikes, and the occasional neighbor chatting over the fence. It was the kind of place where everything fit neatly into the rhythm of everyday life, a place where no one really expected the unexpected. But in one home, that calm was about to shatter. Reginald Carter had lived in his two-story brick house on Elmwood Lane for over a decade. A man of routine, he had long since mastered the art of living quietly, blending into the fabric of suburban life. A former military officer turned FBI agent, Reginald had always kept his profession to himself. His neighbors knew him as the man who always waved hello, kept his lawn pristine, and would occasionally offer advice on DIY projects. The Carter family lived in a well-kept home, nestled between friendly neighbors who often stopped by for brief chats or casual barbecues. Reginald's days were simple. Wake up, drink coffee, walk his dog, take out the trash, and occasionally help a neighbor with their car or offer a word of wisdom when asked. He was liked, respected, even admired in some circles. He had built his life on discipline, quiet service, and most importantly, integrity. Yet on this particular morning, the same street he'd called home for years suddenly felt foreign to him. As he grabbed the trash bag from the garage and stepped out into the quiet morning, his only thought was about getting it to the curb. It was a simple task, one that didn't even warrant a second thought. But just as he reached the driveway, everything stopped. The world paused. There they were. The trio at the end of his driveway stood out like a sore thumb, like figures out of place in this carefully curated suburban dream. Two men in black tactical vests, each with a patch that read "Community Enforcement" stitched across their chests. Reginald's eyes quickly assessed them. Mismatched gear, worn boots, and an air of awkward intimidation. Behind them stood Linda Whitfield, the president of the Homeowners Association. Linda was always the one who handled things. She was the self-appointed enforcer of the neighborhood's rules, the one who kept track of every minor violation, from weeds in the garden to whether a neighbor's paint color had changed without permission. But today, her usual air of self-assurance was gone. Instead of smiling, she stood with her arms crossed tightly, her face flushed with determination. This was no casual visit. "Mr. Carter," she called out, her voice sharper than Reginald had ever heard it before. There was no greeting, no friendly exchange, just business. "We need to talk." Reginald slowed his pace, his feet still on the concrete of his driveway. He studied the trio. The taller of the two men, a pale, imposing figure with mirrored sunglasses, took a step forward, his posture stiff and rehearsed. Reginald's instincts told him something was wrong, but his face remained unreadable. Linda's gaze didn't waver. "You're in violation of neighborhood regulations," she said, her voice crisp, almost too practiced. "We're here to detain you until the police arrive." The words hung in the air. Detain him? Reginald's mind processed the situation quickly, even as his body remained still. Reginald tilted his head, eyes narrowing as he looked from Linda to the two men. The tall one's jaw tightened, clearly waiting for a reaction. The shorter man, with a broad-shouldered frame and a messy beard, looked like he wanted to say something but kept quiet. "You're in violation of neighborhood regulations?" Reginald repeated, his voice calm, though there was an edge to it. "And what exactly does that mean? Detain me?" Linda unfolded a piece of paper. Her eyes briefly flicked to the text before looking back at Reginald. "Unauthorized modifications to your driveway, loud gatherings, property violations," she said, listing off the offenses with precision. Her tone was cold and rehearsed, but Reginald could tell she was trying to keep control. He could almost feel the anxiety underneath her words, the underlying fear of what might happen if she didn't get her way. "Property violations?" Reginald's lips twitched slightly, amused by the absurdity of it all. "So you've sent me notices, you've given me fines, and now you're here with two men in mismatched tactical gear to detain me?" The taller man stepped forward, his eyes hidden behind those dark sunglasses. His posture was stiff, his voice unwavering as he responded. "You're non-compliant. That means we have the right to escalate. You can come peacefully, or we'll make it harder on you." Reginald didn't flinch. The word escalate hung in the air, a challenge. But Reginald knew the game these men were playing. He had seen men like this before, wannabe enforcers who relied on intimidation to do their bidding. But what they didn't realize was that Reginald Carter wasn't just any homeowner. He was a man trained in the art of de-escalation, a man who had dismantled criminal networks and dealt with far worse threats than these two impostors could ever present. Instead of revealing his true identity, Reginald simply leaned forward slightly, eyes sharp and focused. "There's no such thing as community enforcement," he said, his voice steady. "You're not law enforcement. You don't have any authority here." Linda's face flushed a deeper shade of red, her hands gripping the paper in front of her tightly. "You think you're above the rules because of who you are?" she snapped, the words laced with frustration. "We've had complaints, real complaints, Reginald. This has gone too far." Reginald's eyes met the two men. The tall one, his hand hovering near his belt, his body language tense, as if daring Reginald to challenge him. But Reginald knew better. He wasn't intimidated. Not by these men, and not by Linda's false sense of power. With a slow, deliberate movement, he set the trash bag down on the ground. The sound of the bag splitting and a soda can rolling away from it was like a signal, a shift in the atmosphere, one that indicated this wasn't going to be just another minor neighborhood dispute. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Neighbors were watching. Reginald could feel their eyes on him, even if he didn't turn to look. Curtains shifted, phones were pulled out of pockets, and the audience began to grow. Reginald took a slow step forward, his voice calm but edged with steel. "Let me explain something to you. There is no such thing as community enforcement. You're trespassing on my property right now, and unless you're going to show me some real legal authority, you're about to find yourselves in a very bad situation." Linda's eyes narrowed, but she said nothing. The two men exchanged glances. The taller one stepped closer, boots scraping the concrete, as if daring Reginald to make the first move. The battle of wills had begun, and Reginald knew one thing for sure. He wasn't about to lose to these impostors. The neighborhood, too, was beginning to realize that something much bigger was at play here. The moment had arrived and Reginald Carter wasn't backing down. The showdown on Elmwood Lane had begun. The air between them seemed to vibrate with unspoken tension, each of the three impostors standing firm, unwilling to back down, their posture stiffer than ever. Reginald could feel the weight of their scrutiny, but it didn't faze him. He had faced much worse in his career, but today wasn't about his career. It was about his home, his rights, and his neighborhood. Linda's voice broke the silence again, sharp and insistent. "You're not above the rules, Reginald. We've had complaints about you for months. You've been flaunting our HOA guidelines for too long, and this time we're going to make sure you comply. You'll either come with us now or we'll escalate things further." Reginald glanced at the two men standing beside her, their tactical vests slightly out of place in this quiet neighborhood. The taller man, still holding his position, looked like he was ready to strike. But Reginald's gaze was unwavering, his calm demeanor only heightening the unease that was creeping into the impostors' ranks. They had expected to intimidate him, to get him to back down with their misplaced authority. But Reginald wasn't playing by their script. "I've heard enough, Linda," Reginald said quietly, his voice firm yet level. "There is no escalation here. I'm not going anywhere with you or your community enforcers. And let's get one thing straight. You don't have any authority here. You're trespassing. And if you don't leave, I'll have no choice but to call the real authorities." Linda stiffened, her face growing redder by the second. Her gaze darted toward the two men, and for a split second, Reginald saw the briefest flicker of doubt in her eyes. She wasn't used to being challenged like this, not in front of her own neighborhood. "You think you can just throw around your words and expect things to go your way?" she sneered, crossing her arms tighter across her chest. "You've ignored every notice we've sent, every warning. People like you think they can do whatever they want. But I'm done letting you get away with it. You'll be the one answering questions when the police arrive." Reginald's lips curled into a faint smile, almost as if he were amused by her bravado. His eyes never left the taller man, who had started to inch closer, his hand hovering above his belt. Reginald knew what was coming, but he remained steady. "If you think I'm going to let you or your so-called enforcers intimidate me, then you've really miscalculated," Reginald said, his tone now colder, sharper. He stepped forward, closing the distance between them. "I've dealt with far more dangerous men than you two could ever hope to be, and I know how to make this situation end without anyone getting hurt." The taller man's posture stiffened further, but there was an underlying nervousness in his eyes. Reginald saw it clearly now. These men were just playing a role. They had no idea what they were up against. "You're bluffing," the shorter man with the messy beard muttered, his voice shaky but trying to sound tough. "We've got the upper hand. You don't want this to get out of hand." But Reginald's eyes locked onto his with quiet authority. "The only hand you have is one full of lies," Reginald said calmly. "You're not law enforcement. You're not even close. And when the real authorities show up, and trust me, they will, you'll wish you had never come here." A murmur rippled through the small crowd of onlookers that had gathered along the street. Reginald could feel the neighborhood shifting, the tide slowly turning. They were all watching now, waiting to see how this would unfold. Some were already filming, their phones raised to capture every word, every action. Reginald didn't flinch. The more people saw, the clearer the truth would become. Linda, however, was not about to back down. She stepped forward, her voice rising with increasing desperation. "You're trying to turn this into something it's not. This is about order. This is about making sure our neighborhood stays respectable. People like you who ignore the rules are a threat to the community. And if you won't comply, we'll make sure the police know exactly what you've done." Reginald narrowed his eyes, studying her for a long moment. "You don't get to hide behind this order you speak of, Linda. What you're doing isn't about rules. It's about control. It's about your need to feel powerful. and you're using people like these two to do your dirty work." For a brief moment, Linda faltered. Her eyes shifted uncomfortably, her confidence cracking just enough for Reginald to see the cracks in her armor. But then she quickly regained her composure, her voice snapping back into place, though now tinged with frustration. "I'm not going to let you ruin this neighborhood," she spat, her hands shaking slightly as she clenched them into fists. "You've pushed me too far. You've left me no choice." The tall man, Eddie, finally spoke again, his voice stiff and strained. "You can't just defy us like this, Carter. You can either come with us, or we'll make sure it's a lot harder for you." Reginald met his gaze head-on, his stance unyielding. "I've already told you, you're trespassing. And if you think I'm going to let you play this game with me, then you've got another thing coming." At that moment, there was a slight rustle from across the street. Reginald noticed a teenager, Marcus Johnson, holding his phone high and filming the entire scene. His face was illuminated by the glow of the screen, but his eyes were focused intently on the confrontation unfolding in front of him. Marcus wasn't the only one recording now. More phones had appeared, and the crowd that had once watched from behind closed curtains was now openly documenting everything. The realization hit Reginald like a wave. The pressure was building. This wasn't just about him anymore. This wasn't just a personal confrontation. This was becoming a public spectacle, and it was going to get uglier before it got better. "Do yourself a favor, Eddie," Reginald said quietly, his voice cool and controlled. "Take a good look at your position here. The crowd is watching. The cameras are rolling. If you think I'm going to fold under pressure, you're dead wrong." Eddie's hand twitched slightly, and for the first time, Reginald saw the doubt creep into his posture. The man wasn't so sure of himself anymore. Linda, however, wasn't ready to admit defeat. She stepped forward again, her voice now trembling with frustration and fear. "You think you can intimidate me? You think you can scare me into backing down? I've worked too hard for this neighborhood too long. I won't let you ruin it." Reginald smiled faintly, but it wasn't a smile of humor. It was a smile of someone who knew exactly what was happening. "No, Linda," he said softly, his eyes cold. "You've confused control with leadership, and that's where you've failed." The silence between them thickened. Reginald's words lingered in the air, leaving a mark that was impossible to ignore. Behind him, the crowd of neighbors was shifting again, murmurs rising as they processed the words. Reginald's gaze never wavered from Linda's, the weight of his words pressing down on her like a silent verdict. "This isn't about power. This is about integrity, accountability, and responsibility. And you've shown none of those." Linda's mouth opened and closed, her attempts to regain control falling short. The bearded man beside Eddie looked at Linda, and for the first time, there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. The whole situation was starting to fall apart, and Reginald knew it. They had expected to control the narrative, but now the truth was starting to take hold. The real test was coming, and Linda and her enforcers were about to face a reckoning. The tension in the air was almost unbearable now. The neighborhood had shifted from silent observation to active participation. Windows were wide open, phones were held high, and the hum of the crowd seemed to grow louder with every passing second. Reginald could feel every set of eyes on him, the weight of their gaze as heavy as a 100-pound barbell. But unlike Linda, Eddie, and the bearded man, he wasn't intimidated by the attention. He had been in far worse situations, far more dangerous confrontations, and he knew exactly how to handle this. The moment had arrived. Reginald's calm demeanor, which had kept him in control until now, had begun to have its effect. Linda, the once unshakable HOA president, was starting to crumble under the pressure. She shifted uncomfortably, glancing over her shoulder at the growing crowd, clearly aware of the consequences of her actions. "This is a violation of my authority," Linda snapped, her voice cracking. Her hands were shaking, her arms still crossed tightly over her chest, as if she could somehow will herself back into control. "I won't stand by and let you undermine this community. You're threatening everything we've worked for." Reginald's eyes narrowed. He could hear the desperation in her voice, but he was done playing by her rules. It was time for the truth to come out. Time for her to face the reality of what she had done. "You've been hiding behind false authority for too long, Linda," he said, his voice steady, but with an edge that cut through the air like a blade. "This isn't about protecting your community. This is about your need to control people, to dominate them with fear. You thought you could get away with it because you thought no one would question you. But you were wrong." Linda flinched, the sting of his words hitting her harder than she expected. Her eyes darted nervously to Eddie and the bearded man, but there was no backup. The tall man, Eddie, stood frozen, still clutching the cuffs in his hand like a lifeline that no longer seemed to offer him the comfort it once had. Reginald could see the flicker of doubt in his eyes, the cracks beginning to form in their plan. "You don't have the authority to do this," Reginald continued, stepping forward, his presence growing even more imposing. "You don't even know what authority looks like. Let me show you." Without warning, Reginald reached into his pocket and pulled out his badge. He held it high enough for the crowd to see, the gold gleaming in the sunlight, catching the attention of every person within sight. "I'm Special Agent Reginald Carter," he announced, his voice cutting through the growing murmurs of disbelief and shock. "FBI. These men aren't enforcing any rules. They're pretending to be law enforcement. They're imposters, and I'm arresting them for impersonating officers and trespassing." The world seemed to stop in that moment. Eddie's face drained of color. His mouth opened, but no words came out. The bearded man stepped back, his body stiff with realization that their carefully constructed charade was collapsing before their very eyes. The crowd, once passive observers, was now fully engaged, their eyes wide with disbelief, their phones capturing every second of the unfolding scene. Linda's face twisted with shock and rage. "No!" she spat, her voice rising in panic. "This isn't happening! You're lying! You don't have the right to do this! But Reginald cut her off, his tone unwavering. "You think I'm lying? You think I'm just some random homeowner who won't fight back? You're in way over your head, Linda." The bearded man, now clearly unnerved, took a step back, glancing toward Eddie. "We need to get out of here," he muttered, his voice low, his resolve crumbling. But Eddie, still clutching the cuffs, shook his head violently. "No," he said, his voice hoarse but determined. "We finish this. We arrest him. He's resisting. We'll take him down, now." Reginald's lips curled into a thin smile, but it was the kind of smile that didn't invite comfort. It was the smile of a man who had seen the endgame and knew exactly how to play it. "You really want to escalate this?" he asked, his voice colder now, a dangerous edge creeping in. Eddie didn't respond immediately. His hand hovered over the cuffs, his fingers shaking ever so slightly. Reginald saw it, the hesitation, the doubt, and he pounced on it. "Go ahead, Eddie. Make your move. See what happens when you try to arrest a federal agent in front of your entire neighborhood," Reginald said, his voice barely above a whisper but sharp enough to cut through the thickening air. "Do it. You'll be the one in handcuffs by the time the real police arrive." The taller man's eyes darted from Reginald to the crowd. His hands trembled, and for the first time his bravado faltered. The imposter who had been so eager to enforce the rules was now standing on the edge of a precipice, caught between his own pride and the reality of the situation. A tense silence stretched between them. The world seemed to hold its breath, and then it happened. In one swift motion, Reginald stepped forward, his body shifting with the precision of someone who had been trained for this. He sidestepped Eddie's grab, and in an instant, his hand was around the man's wrist, twisting it behind his back with surgical precision. The cuffs, once held out as a threat, were now clanging against Eddie's own wrists as Reginald secured him with effortless efficiency. It was over in less than 3 seconds. The crowd erupted, not in applause, but in a stunned mixture of disbelief and awe. Eddie, his face contorted in shock, stumbled forward, the cuffs now securing him as the imposter was taken down, not by force but by skill. Reginald held him firmly, his demeanor calm, as though this was just another day at the office. "Get him out of here," Reginald said coolly, his eyes scanning the crowd. He didn't gloat, didn't revel in the moment. He simply spoke with authority. "He's your problem now." The real police were already on their way, and they weren't going to be fooled by this charade. Reginald's eyes shifted toward Linda, whose face was a mask of outrage, her eyes wild with disbelief. "You're under arrest for impersonating a federal officer and for attempting unlawful restraint," Reginald said, his voice unwavering. "You don't get to pretend to be the law." The crowd shifted. The whispers turned to shouts. People were no longer silent. They had witnessed something extraordinary, something they would remember for a long time. But Linda wasn't done yet. "You don't get to do this to me!" she screamed, her voice breaking. "I'm the HOA president. I run this neighborhood. This isn't over, Carter." Reginald didn't respond. Instead, he stood tall, unflinching, as he watched the police arrive. 2 squad cars pulled up, their sirens blaring. Officers stepped out, their eyes scanning the scene. "Hands where we can see them," one officer barked. Reginald raised one hand, holding his badge up for the officers to see, his other hand still securing Eddie, now on his knees. "I'm Special Agent Reginald Carter with the FBI," he said, his voice steady. "These 2 attempted to impersonate officers. I'm detaining them until you arrive." The officers glanced at Reginald's badge, then back at Eddie and the bearded man, both cuffed and kneeling in front of the entire neighborhood. The officers' expressions shifted from suspicion to acknowledgement. They had all the evidence they needed. "We'll take it from here," one officer said as he moved to secure the 2 imposters. Linda, on the other hand, was still standing in the middle of the street, her face flushed with rage, her arms trembling at her sides. She opened her mouth to protest again, but Reginald's words were the final verdict. "You've lost," he said quietly, his voice carrying to her through the silence. "This is over." As the squad cars pulled up and the officers took control of the situation, Reginald remained calm, his eyes fixed on the 2 men who were now being detained. The moment was far from over, but the momentum had shifted irrevocably. The crowd, once filled with nervous tension, now buzzed with a sense of justice served. Phones were still raised, capturing every detail, ensuring that every inch of the drama was documented for posterity. Reginald's actions had spoken louder than words ever could. The imposter enforcers were now powerless, their false authority exposed for all to see. Eddie, still on his knees, could hardly meet the eyes of the neighbors who had gathered. His shoulders slumped, and the bravado that had once fueled his actions was now replaced with regret. His cuffs rattled as the officers lifted him to his feet, the metallic sound echoing down the street. The bearded man, whose name Reginald had overheard earlier as Sean, stood back, his hands raised in surrender, his body tense and unsure. "Not so confident now, are you?" Reginald's voice cut through the growing murmurs of the crowd. Though he wasn't speaking to either of the imposters, he was speaking to Linda. She stood frozen, her face pale, her arms still crossed tightly over her chest, though her posture had lost its former command. There was no more authority in her stance, no more certainty in her words. The truth had come crashing down around her, and she was left standing there, exposed in front of her own neighbors. "Ma'am," one of the officers said, his voice neutral but firm, "we'll need you to step aside. You're going to need to come with us as well." Linda blinked, clearly caught off guard by the officer's words. "No," she stammered, her voice cracking. "I didn't do anything wrong. I was just trying to enforce the rules of the neighborhood. The officer's tone remained professional. "Ma'am, we've got multiple witnesses, and we've seen enough to know that you've broken the law. We'll need you to cooperate and come with us." Linda's face flushed with frustration and anger, but she had no ground to stand on anymore. The truth had already taken root, and the officer's steady resolve only served to make her situation clearer. The neighbors around her, once her supporters, were now silent in their disapproval. Reginald's words had already settled in their minds, and they weren't willing to defend her anymore. The officer placed a hand gently on Linda's arm, guiding her toward the squad car. Her resistance was weak, and it quickly faded as she realized she was out of options. She stumbled slightly, her high heels clicking against the pavement, but it was clear that her confidence was gone. Sean, the bearded man, stood off to the side, his face pale with guilt. His hands were shaking, and when the officer turned toward him, he muttered, "I didn't sign up for this. I just wanted to help, but I didn't know she was going to do all this." The officer glanced at him, his voice more understanding than before. "You'll need to give a statement. If you want to avoid further trouble, you'll need to be honest about what happened here today." I'll cooperate," Sean stammered. "I didn't think it would go this far. She made it sound like we were doing the right thing. I didn't know we were breaking the law." The officer nodded, his face a mixture of skepticism and sympathy. "We'll take it from here. Just tell the truth." As Linda was escorted to the squad car, she turned back one last time, her eyes blazing with a mix of desperation and anger. "You haven't heard the last of this, Carter?" she yelled, her voice trembling with fury. "I'm the HOA president. I'm in charge here, and I'll make sure you regret this." Reginald didn't respond. He didn't need to. The look in his eyes was enough. The fight was over. The crowd, which had once been uncertain, now seemed to settle into a unified understanding. Neighbors who had been too afraid to speak out against Linda's heavy-handed tactics now stood taller, their shoulders squared, their voices rising in quiet but confident agreement. The balance of power had shifted. Reginald turned to face the officers who were now leading Linda and Eddie toward the patrol cars. His job here was done, but there was a weight on his shoulders that hadn't lifted yet. Not because of the confrontation itself, but because of the message it had sent. It wasn't just about the fake enforcers or the false authority. It was about standing up for what was right, even when the odds were stacked against you. As Linda was loaded into the back of the squad car, her face twisted with frustration, the final vestiges of her control slipping away. Reginald's gaze never wavered from her, though there was no malice in his eyes, just quiet finality. She had pushed the neighborhood too far, and now it was time to answer for her actions. The officer in charge turned to Reginald, offering him a respectful nod. "Thanks for your patience, Agent Carter. We've got everything under control now. We'll take it from here." Reginald nodded in return, his expression calm. "Just doing what's right," he said quietly. "I'll testify if needed, but I'm confident this won't be forgotten." The officer gave him a grateful look before turning back to his team. As the squad cars slowly pulled away, carrying Eddie, Linda, and Sean with them, Reginald stood still, watching the scene unfold. The neighborhood was quieter now, but there was an unmistakable sense of change in the air. The balance of power had shifted. The people who had once cowered in silence, afraid to speak out, were now emboldened by the events that had just transpired. Reginald's presence in the neighborhood was no longer just that of a neighbor. It was that of someone who had reminded them of the true meaning of authority, not the kind that comes from titles or threats, but the kind that comes from standing firm for what's right, even when it's hard. Reginald took a deep breath, allowing the weight of the moment to settle around him. He hadn't come here to become a hero, but he knew that sometimes the right thing to do wasn't about accolades. It was about taking a stand when it mattered most. And as the sounds of the neighborhood returned to normal, with neighbors returning to their lawns and children resuming their play, Reginald Carter knew that his work wasn't over. He had planted the seed of change, but it was up to the community to carry it forward. The real work, the work of building a community based on respect, accountability, and trust, was only just beginning. The days following the confrontation were a blur of press inquiries, legal proceedings, and a steady stream of conversations that rippled through the once quiet neighborhood. The flashing lights of the squad cars had faded, but the echoes of that fateful day still reverberated in every corner of the community. Reginald Carter's quiet stand against the intimidation tactics of Linda Whitfield, the HOA president, had become the talk of the town and beyond. The story quickly spread, not just through Plano, but across the country, as neighbors and strangers alike marveled at how a simple homeowner had stood up to an oppressive system built on fear and false authority. By the following weekend, the headlines were filled with stories of HOA president detained after confrontation with FBI agent neighbor. Videos from the street, including Reginald's calm revelation of his true identity, had gone viral, circulating through Facebook, Instagram, and news outlets alike. On one of the local Dallas channels, the anchor described it as a moment when truth cut through false authority. And yet Reginald had never sought the spotlight. He never expected to be hailed as a hero. For him, the real victory wasn't the media attention or the admiration that came from it. It was the message that had been sent. The day he stood on his driveway wasn't about him. It was about standing up for what was right for his home and for his neighbors. It was a reminder that sometimes the most important battles were fought on familiar streets, not foreign battlefields. The neighborhood itself began to shift in subtle ways. People who had once kept to themselves now spoke freely, sharing their thoughts on what had happened. The Hendersons, the retired couple who had always kept to themselves, now made it a point to wave at Reginald whenever they saw him in the yard. Mrs. Henderson, who had watched the entire confrontation from her porch, stopped by one afternoon with a fresh batch of cookies as a gesture of thanks. "You know, Agent Carter," she said, her eyes still wide with disbelief, "you did this community a real service. You gave us the courage to stand up against the kind of things we've put up with for years. Linda might have been the president, but she wasn't the leader." Reginald smiled faintly as he took the cookies from her. "I just did what anyone would do, Mrs. Henderson. It's about doing what's right when it matters." The impact of his actions continued to ripple outward, from the quiet conversations on porches to the more formal meetings at the HOA. By Tuesday, a special meeting had been called to discuss the recent events. The neighborhood, once divided by Linda's heavy-handed leadership, was now united in their desire for change. The HOA Board's first order of business was the removal of Linda from her position as president. The meeting was tense but necessary, and by the end of it, the majority of the board had voted to strip her of her power. The new president, Harold Jennings, a quiet man with a reputation for transparency and fairness, was voted in. Under his leadership, the atmosphere began to shift. Homeowners felt empowered, knowing their voices would be heard and their concerns addressed. No longer would they fear arbitrary fines for minor infractions or, worse, the use of force to enforce a neighborhood's rules. Reginald, however, had no intention of becoming involved in HOA politics. He simply returned to his routine, walking his dog, chatting with neighbors, and offering help when needed. But he knew that things had changed. The neighborhood, once stifled by Linda's control, was now alive with the possibility of a better future, one built on mutual respect, fairness, and accountability. The real impact of that Saturday morning, however, came in the form of a conversation that took place a few days later in the community park. It wasn't a formal meeting, just a group of parents and children gathered on the grass for a casual get-together. As Reginald walked by, a few of them waved him over. "Agent Carter," one of the fathers, Mike, called out, "we wanted to thank you. What you did, it was more than just standing up for yourself. It was a wake-up call for all of us." Reginald approached them, his eyes scanning the group. A few teenagers were there, their phones still buzzing from the live stream they had captured of the confrontation. But it wasn't just the younger generation who had been impacted. The parents, too, had taken a hard look at the situation and realized they had let fear and intimidation rule their community for too long. What you showed us, Mike continued, was that leadership isn't about control. It's about doing the right thing, even when it's hard. You showed us how to stand up to the bullies, how to fight for what's right, not just for ourselves, but for the whole community. Reginald nodded, taking it all in. Leadership isn't about titles, he said. It's about service. It's about putting the needs of others before your own and earning respect, not demanding it. One of the teenagers, Marcus, who had been filming the entire incident, spoke up. I think we all learned that the hard way. I've been posting stuff on social media for a while, but after seeing what happened with you, it's not just about getting views. It's about showing people what real leadership looks like. What you did, man, that's what we need more of. Reginald smiled at the boy, proud of the direction he was heading. You've got the power to make a difference with your platform, Marcus. Use it to show the truth, to spread respect, and to fight for justice. That's the kind of leader you should aim to be. As the conversation continued, more people joined the circle. The conversation shifted from what had happened to what could happen next. How could they ensure this didn't become just another story that faded away? How could they protect the community they had built, ensuring that no one could manipulate or intimidate them again? The truth, they realized, was simple. It wasn't just about standing up to Linda. It was about holding each other accountable. It was about recognizing that true authority came from a shared commitment to fairness, integrity, and respect. Reginald didn't have all the answers, but he knew that this conversation, these realizations, were the first steps toward something better. As he walked away from the park that day, he couldn't help but feel a sense of peace settle in. The battle had been won, not through force, but through truth and courage. And that, in the end, was what would make the biggest difference. As the sun set over Plano, the neighborhood had begun to heal. The scars of the past few weeks were still fresh, but they would eventually fade. What remained was something stronger. A community that knew its own power, that understood what it meant to stand up for what was right, and that would never let fear dictate their future again. For Reginald, that was the true victory, and it was one that would last far longer than any moment of confrontation. It was a victory that would echo through the streets of Elmwood Lane for years to come. The truth, after all, always comes to light. And once it did, there was no turning back.